The SEAL team lost hope. Then a legendary female sniper walked back with their commander. The radio had been silent for 31 hours. Jordan Reese counted the hours the way a man counts the last of his water, carefully, with full knowledge of what the number means. He sat with his back against the compound's mud wall, his rifle across his knees, and he looked at the 6 men around him the way a commander looks at men he is trying not to lose. They were tired, they were dirty. They were running calculations in their heads that none of them were saying out loud, because saying them out loud would make the numbers real, and the numbers were already real enough. The compound sat at the edge of a dry riverbed in Khost Province, eastern Afghanistan, and the cold that came off the mountains at night was the kind of cold that found every gap in your jacket, in your gloves, in the space between a rational thought and the one that followed it. Bravo team had been inside Afghanistan's eastern belt for 6 days. The mission was surveillance. 12 hours in, the mission became something else entirely. On the second night, a firefight broke out 2 ridges east of their position. It was brief and violent, and by the time it ended, their commanding officer, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Delaine, was not where he was supposed to be. The team swept the area. They found a dead combatant. They found shell casings. They found the distinct track of a boot that matched Delaine's size moving northeast toward the ridge, and then the track disappeared where the rocky ground gave way to loose shale and told nothing more. Reese had made the call to hold position and wait for a communication window. The communication window came and went with no signal from Delaine, then another one, then 6 more. Now it was the 31st hour, and Reese was sitting with his back against the wall counting them. His second, a quiet and precise man named Owen Garrett, crouched beside him with a notebook that contained their remaining inventory. Garrett did not need the notebook. He had the numbers memorized. He carried the notebook because writing things down was how he held himself together, and Reese had long since stopped pointing that out. "We're good on ammunition for another engagement," Garrett said. He kept his voice flat, which was his version of careful. "Water's the issue. Another 18 hours at current consumption and we start making hard choices." "We're not making hard choices," Reese said. Garrett looked at him. "We're waiting," Reese said. "That's not a plan." "It is right now." Garrett put the notebook away. Across the compound, 2 men, Nate Hollies and Cal Prout, were sitting close enough to share body heat without acknowledging that was what they were doing. Hollies was 24 years old and had been on 2 prior deployments that had not prepared him for this one. Prout was 31 and had seen worse, or said he had, and either way he was the one Hollies stayed close to when the hours got long and the silence got loud. At the far end of the compound, near the collapsed section of the northern wall, Ben Crowder was cleaning his rifle for the second time in 4 hours. Crowder cleaned his rifle when he was anxious. He had been cleaning it a great deal. Nobody commented. The sound of it, methodical, familiar, had become something close to comforting in the silence. Reese had written the casualty report 20 hours ago. He had not filed it yet because filing it required a working uplink, and the uplink was intermittently functional at best, but the report existed. He had typed Delaine's name into the field that asked for the name, and then he had sat for a long time looking at the screen before he closed the device and put it in his pack and stopped looking at it. He did not tell the team he had written it. He was fairly certain at least 2 of them knew anyway. That was the nature of men who operated in close quarters for long enough. They developed a kind of peripheral awareness of each other's states that functioned without words. Reese could tell from the way Hollies had gone still that morning and the way Prout had shifted to keep his shoulder against the younger man's that they had done their own math. He could tell from the way Garrett had stopped making small jokes. Garrett always made small jokes, terrible ones, jokes that landed with a sound like a stone dropped in still water, that Garrett had done his math too. The math kept coming out the same. 31 hours without a signal. Eastern Afghan terrain, 1 man, November cold. Reese did not do the math. He refused to. It was not denial. He was too experienced for denial. It was a deliberate choice to keep the problem in the category of unsolved rather than the category of finished. A solved problem required a response. An unsolved one allowed him to keep moving, keep managing, keep treating the situation as something that still had a solution somewhere ahead of it. He was doing that when the secondary radio crackled. Not the primary channel, not the frequency they used for standard communication with FOB Salerno. The secondary channel, a frequency so low in the rotation that Reese almost didn't catch it, produced 2 seconds of static and then a voice. Clipped, faint, distorted by terrain and distance and whatever equipment was being used to transmit it, but unmistakably a voice and unmistakably one he recognized. 2 words. They made no tactical sense. They were not a position report, not a status update, not a grid coordinate. They were a landmark, something personal, specific, and entirely unreadable to anyone who didn't already know what they meant. Reese had heard Delane use those 2 words once before, 18 months ago in a different country, in a different situation that had also looked, at one point, like it had no solution. He sat very still for a moment after the transmission ended. Then he stood up and walked to the center of the compound and said, "He's alive." Nobody asked him how he knew, not even Garrett. The way Reese said it, steady, without the particular controlled quality that meant he was managing uncertainty, told them what they needed to know. He wasn't hoping, he was reporting. Hollis let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. Prout clapped him once on the back and said nothing. Crowder put down the rifle and just sat. Garrett walked over to Reese and said very quietly, "What did he say?" "Enough. Where is he?" "I don't know yet. But he's moving." "He's transmitting," Reese said, "which means he's functional enough to transmit. Everything else we wait on." He opened the uplink and sent a brief, coded message to Salerno. 40 minutes later, Salerno replied, 2 sentences. The first sentence confirmed that Command had also received a partial transmission from Delane's secondary equipment and was actively tracking the signal source. The second sentence was the one that changed the temperature of the compound. A recovery asset was already inbound. No further details. Asset designation classified. Estimated arrival at the extraction point was 4 hours. Reese read the message twice. He read the phrase recovery asset and understood that Command had already known more than they had shared with his team, and that they had dispatched whatever this asset was before Bravo Team's uplink had even come back online, which meant the asset had been moving since before the 31st hour, possibly since before the 20th. He thought about what that meant. He thought about who or what qualified as a classified recovery asset in this particular geography, attached to naval special warfare, operating independently in terrain that had just demonstrated it could swallow a veteran chief petty officer without leaving a trace. He thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then he put the device away and told the team to eat something and check their equipment. They had 4 hours and they were going to use them. Hollis asked who the asset was. Reese said he didn't know. He was telling the truth. He did not know the name. He had a shape in his mind, not a person exactly, more like a category of person he had heard referenced in quiet conversations, in half-stories told by men who spoke with the particular restraint of people who are permitted to know something but not to explain it fully. He had heard the phrase CSD operator used in a tone that did not match the bureaucratic neutrality of the letters. He had heard it used the way people refer to something they respect, without being entirely comfortable with how much they respect it. He checked his own equipment methodically and did not think about the casualty report still sitting in his pack, already written, already signed, waiting only for a working uplink and the word that would make it necessary. The 4 hours passed the way hard hours pass, slowly at the front end and then in a rush at the back. The cold deepened. Hollis and Prout stayed close. Garrett stopped writing in his notebook and started watching the perimeter with the focused patience of a man who has converted his anxiety into attention, which is the most productive thing anxiety can become. Ben Crowder at the north wall was the first one to pick up movement on the thermal scope. He said nothing dramatic. He simply said, "Something's coming in from the east," and then, after a pause, 2 people. Reese moved to the scope and looked. 2 people, one moving independently, one being supported. He adjusted the scope and looked at the one doing the supporting. The gait, the method, the particular way a person moves when they have been moving in exactly this way for a very long time and have decided that stopping is not something they are going to do. He did not know her name yet. He would learn it later in a context that was also classified, in a conversation he would also never be permitted to repeat in full. But he watched her come across that frozen ground with Marcus Delane's weight against her shoulder, 3 kilometers from where she had found him, 19 hours after she had found him, and he understood the way you understand things that arrive without explanation, that whatever category of person he had heard referenced in those quiet conversations, the one he had not been able to fully picture, was currently walking toward him through the dark. He lowered the scope. Around him, 6 men were doing the same kind of math they had been doing for 31 hours, but the numbers were coming out differently now. He told them to hold position and stand by. He waited. Elena Vasquez found Marcus Delane at hour 7. She had been on the ground for 19 hours by the time she walked him out, but the finding happened at hour 7, and everything after that was a different kind of work. The work that does not appear in any training manual because training manuals are written by people who have to account for variables, and what Vasquez did across those remaining 12 hours contained variables that no document could have anticipated or planned for. She had been inserted 6 kilometers from Bravo Team's last known position, alone, with a kit that weighed 38 pounds and a mission brief that contained 4 lines of usable information and a great deal of operational discretion, which is another way of saying that command knew the situation was too fluid for specific instructions and trusted her to make the right calls in sequence. This was not a compliment she had ever found comfortable. It was, however, the kind of trust she had spent 11 years earning, and she understood the weight of it the way you understand something you carry all the time. Elena Vasquez was 36 years old. She had grown up in Albuquerque, the middle child of a school principal and a retired Air Force mechanic, and she had been the kind of kid who dismantled things to understand how they worked and then put them back together correctly, which turned out to be a useful quality in more than one field. She had joined the Army at 22 after 2 years of college that had felt, in ways she couldn't articulate at the time, too contained. She had moved through the pipeline of training and deployment and further training with the kind of systematic patience that looks, to outside observers, like an absence of urgency but is actually its opposite. She had been selected for the Cultural Support Team program 6 years ago, which meant she was attached to special operations units in roles that required capabilities the male operators in those units were not, for various reasons, positioned to perform. In practice, this meant she went places they couldn't go, spoke to people they couldn't approach, gathered information that couldn't be gathered any other way, and when the situation required it, which it did more often than her official file acknowledged, she performed tasks that were indistinguishable from what the men beside her were doing, except that her name would not appear in the same section of the report. She had been told more than once that this was simply the nature of the program. She had understood that, and she had made her peace with it, and she had continued doing the work, because the work was real regardless of what the report said about it. On this particular morning, in Coast Province, with the temperature sitting at 4 degrees Celsius and a wind coming off the mountains that made it feel like zero, she was moving northeast along a drainage channel that her topographical reading told her was the most logical route for a man avoiding open ground. She was moving fast and low, reading the terrain with the automatic attention of someone who has spent enough time in this kind of environment that her nervous system has learned to process it without requiring conscious instruction. She found the combatant first. He was at the base of the drainage channel's eastern wall, and he had been there for approximately 6 hours based on the temperature of the area around him. Beside him was a weapon that had been recently fired. Not his weapon, his was 3 feet away, and it had not been fired recently. She read the scene in about 8 seconds. Then she heard a sound from further up the channel, shallow and controlled, the specific rhythm of someone managing pain rather than succumbing to it, and she moved toward it. Marcus Delane was wedged between 2 large rocks at the channel's bend, in a position that had clearly been chosen deliberately. He had his back protected, his sightline clear, and the weapon he had taken from the combatant resting across his lap. He was conscious, barely. His right leg was the problem. The compound fracture was obvious and had been dealt with, a field splint made from materials Vasquez could identify without asking where they came from, but the effort of making it had cost him, and the temperature had cost him more, and the 36 hours of staying still and quiet and alive in a drainage channel in Afghan Highland had cost him everything else. He looked at her without surprise. Later, he would tell her that he had stopped being surprised by much of anything around hour 20, which she understood. Vasquez, she said, by way of introduction, because introduction felt like the right place to start. Delane, he said, his voice was working, which was a good sign. You by yourself? Yes. He absorbed this. Command sent one person. Command sent the right person, she said, which was not arrogance. It was a simple statement of operational logic, and he accepted it as such. She opened her kit and started working on him. The fracture was stable, which was the best news the leg had to offer. His core temperature was lower than she wanted. She addressed that first, with the efficiency of someone who understands that the order of operations is everything, and then she gave him water and something for the pain that would take the edge off without compromising his ability to move, because she needed him to be able to move. How far? He asked. 6 kilometers to the extraction point. He said nothing for a moment. With your leg, she said before he could ask, we'll cover it in 12 hours if we move well, probably less. Probably less, he repeated, with the faint tone of someone who appreciates precision. Your team is 4 kilometers west. They're intact. They're waiting. Something crossed his face at that, brief, controlled, the face of a man who has been carrying the weight of not knowing and just had it removed. He put it away quickly, in the manner of men trained to manage what they feel in the field. But she saw it and she noted it, and she let him have the moment without comment. They began moving at hour 8. Moving Marcus Delaine across 6 kilometers of Coast Province Highland in November, with a compound fracture on his right leg and a body that had been operating on reserves for 36 hours, was a logistical problem with exactly one solution: patience combined with absolute refusal to stop. Vasquez had learned, over 11 years of doing things that required both qualities simultaneously, that the combination was its own kind of skill, not the dramatic skill that gets talked about, but the durable kind that actually finishes things. She took his weight on her left side and matched her pace to his. When the terrain required it, she directed his movement with the economy of someone who has thought 3 steps ahead and is already accounting for what she found when she got there. When he needed to stop, she let him stop, and she used the pause to read the ground ahead and recalibrate the route, and then they moved again. At hour 9, he told her about his daughter. He said it simply, the way people say things they have been holding for a long time when they finally find a quiet moment and a person who feels, for whatever reason, like the right one to say it to. Her name was Claire. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, which he said was a concerning combination. He had submitted a resignation before this deployment, not an official announcement, just the paperwork started, the intention declared, because he had done the math on how much time Claire had left before she stopped needing him the way a 7-year-old needs a father, and the number had not been a comfortable one. Vasquez listened. She did not respond, not because she had nothing to say. She had things to say, some of them even appropriate, but because what he needed was not a response. He needed to say it. He had been saying it in his head for 36 hours in a drainage channel, and now he was saying it out loud, and the act of saying it out loud was the point. She kept moving. She let him talk. When he finished, she said, "Step here, not there. The ground's unstable to your left." He stepped where she told him to. They kept moving. At hour 11, they encountered a problem. 3 men moving along the ridge above the drainage channel, following a path that would bring them directly into the route Vasquez had planned. She assessed them in about 4 seconds. She altered the route, moving them deeper into the channel and further east than she wanted, adding approximately 40 minutes to the journey. Delaine recognized what she was doing without being told. He adjusted his pace without being asked. They did not speak about it afterward. The decision had been made, executed, and was behind them. That was enough. At hour 14, with 2 kilometers remaining, Delaine's reserves ran out in the way that reserves run out, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the progressive manner of a system that has been operating beyond its capacity and has simply reached the end of what it can sustain. He was still conscious, still moving, but the pace dropped and the weight against her shoulder increased, and she felt, in the mechanics of his stride, the difference between a man who is in pain and a man who is getting past it. She stopped them behind a rock formation and let him sit. She sat beside him and pulled out a protein bar from her kit and opened it and ate it with the same attention she gave everything else, methodical, without drama, because her body needed the calories, and she treated that fact the same way she treated all operational requirements, directly and without sentiment. He watched her. "You do this a lot," he said. "Define a lot. Come get people." She finished the protein bar and folded the wrapper and put it in her kit. "I do what the mission requires." "That's not an answer." "It is," she said, "actually." He looked at the ground, then he looked at her. "Command doesn't publicize this." "No, that doesn't bother you." She thought about the box in the closet of her rental unit in Virginia Beach, the commendations inside it. The number of them, the fact that they existed and were real and had been given to her by people who meant them, and also the fact that they lived in a box in a closet and not on a wall. She thought about what question to answer, because what he was asking had more than one layer, and only one of the layers was really about whether it bothered her. "The mission got done," she said. "You're alive, your team is waiting, that's what's in the record that matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What are the two words you transmitted?" "A landmark." "Mining." "Meaning I've been here before," she said. "Not this place, this situation, and I came out the other side, and so will you." He didn't ask anything else. She got him upright and they covered the last 2 kilometers in 90 minutes, which was better than she had projected, because Delane turned out to have one more reserve he hadn't known about until he needed it. That was true of most people, in her experience. The last reserve was always the hardest to find and always the most reliable once you found it. The compound came into view at hour 19. She could see the thermal signature of the team through the walls, 7 men, gathered, waiting. The overwatch position at the north wall had a scope on them. She knew they were visible and she kept moving at the same pace, because running was for situations that required running, and this one required something else. She keyed her radio one more time as they approached. Not a status update, just the same 2 words she had transmitted earlier, her landmark, her personal signal that the thing that looked impossible had been found to be possible, again, as it always was when you kept moving long enough. Then she walked Marcus Delane through the darkness toward the light his team was holding for him, and the ground under her boots was frozen and uneven, and she watched every step of it. And she did not look at the photograph in her kit that she had not looked at since hour 3, and she thought about nothing except the next step and the one after that, which was the only thought that had ever gotten her anywhere worth going. Jordan Reese saw them come through the perimeter at 2:47. He had been watching the approach for 11 minutes on the thermal scope, tracking the 2 signatures across the open ground north of the compound, and even through the grainy resolution of the image, he could read the mechanics of what he was seeing. The person on the left was doing the work. The person on the right was still contributing, still moving his own weight forward, not being dragged, but the architecture of the pair was clear. One was carrying the other through sheer refusal to allow any other outcome. He had seen Delane's walk 1,000 times. He would have known it in worse conditions than these. The person beside him, the one whose gait had not changed in the 11 minutes he had been watching, steady, controlled, reading the ground 3 steps ahead, was someone he had never seen before. He went to the gap in the eastern wall and waited. Owen Garrett appeared at his left shoulder without being called. Ben Crowder moved to cover the approach. Nate Hollies and Cal Prout held their positions, and Reese noted that Hollies had stopped breathing the way people breathe when they're managing something and had started breathing the way people breathe when the thing they've been managing is about to resolve itself. They came through the gap. Delane first, because Elena Vasquez angled her body to move him through the narrower space ahead of her, a small adjustment made without thought and without requiring instruction. Delane looked at Reese, and his face did the thing it always did when it was doing a great deal, which was, essentially, nothing. The control was total, but his eyes were doing something different, and Reese received it without comment. "Chief," Reese said. "Reese," Delane said. His voice was rough and low and absolutely his. "Status. Team is intact. You're the only one who went anywhere. I noticed. Can you walk?" "I've been walking for 12 hours. I mean without help." Delane glanced at Vasquez, who had stepped clear of him and was standing 2 feet away, and the glance contained something, acknowledgement, or something close to it, that Reese filed away. Then Delane looked back at Reese and said, "Ask me in the morning." Garrett moved in from the left to take Delane's weight, and Delane allowed it the way experienced operators allow assistance, pragmatically, without letting it mean more than it needs to mean. They moved toward the center of the compound where the medical kit was, and Crowder fell in behind them, and Hollies was already moving to help, and within 30 seconds the center of the compound was organized around the task of getting Marcus Delane stabilized for the medical evacuation that was now 28 minutes out. Vasquez walked to the compound wall. She found a section of it that was intact and relatively sheltered from the wind, and she sat down against it with the settled quality of someone who has been on their feet for 19 hours and has decided that the next part of the work for now is to sit. She pulled off her pack and set it beside her. She opened it and removed a protein bar, a different one from the one she had eaten at the 2-kilometer mark, and she opened it and ate it. That was it. No debrief posture, no self-introduction to the team, no gesture toward the activity at the center of the compound that might be interpreted as seeking recognition. She simply sat against the wall and ate a protein bar, and the methodical attention she gave this task was identical to the attention she had given every other task across the previous 19 hours, because it was, in fact, the same task, keeping the system operational. Reese watched her. He had turned from the activity at the compound's center. Garrett and Holly's had it. They didn't need him for the moment. And he had looked at the woman sitting against the wall, and he had held that look for approximately 3 seconds. He would not remember afterward what he said when Delane was lowered to the ground. He would remember those 3 seconds. What he was looking at, though he did not have language for it in the moment, was competence stripped of performance. It was a thing he had encountered rarely in his career and always recognized immediately, the quality of a person who does difficult things without requiring the doing of them to be witnessed, not because they are indifferent to recognition, but because the work itself is the complete transaction. The protein bar, the wall, the 19 hours that preceded both, all of it the same thing. He walked over and crouched in front of her. "Reese," he said. She looked at him without the particular wariness that people sometimes wore when they were in an unfamiliar team's space and were uncertain of their reception. She did not look uncertain of anything. "Vasquez," she said. "How is he, actually, not the version he told me?" She ate the last of the protein bar and folded the wrapper. "Fracture is stable. Core temperature was low when I found him, but he's been generating heat for the last 8 hours. He needs a hospital for the leg and probably 48 hours of monitored recovery for everything else. He'll be functional well within the window his daughter needs him to be functional." Reese absorbed the last part of that sentence. It landed in a particular way. "He told you about his daughter." "He talked, I moved." Reese nodded. He stayed crouched for a moment, thinking about what to say next, and then he realized there was nothing to say that matched the weight of what had just been walked in through his perimeter, so he said the only thing that was actually adequate. "Thank you." Vasquez looked at him with the expression of someone who receives thanks in the same spirit they receive any other piece of operational information, acknowledged, noted, neither inflated nor dismissed. 26 minutes, she said. "To the extraction," he said. "I'd recommend having him ready to move in 20. "Agreed." He stood up and went back to work. Across the compound, the team moved around Delane with the efficiency of people who know what they're doing and are relieved to be doing it. Crowder had the medical kit open. Holly's was doing the assessment with the careful thoroughness of someone who understands that thorough is the only way to do it. Prout was running the comms, coordinating the final approach of the medical evacuation, his voice low and even. Garrett was beside Delane, and they were talking quietly, real talking, not operational talking, and Reese let it be. At the 17-minute mark, Delane asked Vasquez a question. Reese was close enough to hear the question, though he would later decide that what he had heard was his own business and not anyone else's. He heard her answer, 4 words, quiet, direct, without the quality of a statement designed for an audience. He saw something cross Delane's face that the compound fracture and the 36 hours in the drainage channel and the 19 hours of being walked out had not put there. Then the extraction window opened and the team moved, and the compound that had held them for 6 days became, in the space of 4 minutes, something they had already left behind. Vasquez moved with them to the extraction point. She stayed at the perimeter while the medical team worked and the helicopter descended and Delane was loaded. She did not board the aircraft. Her extraction was separate, a different vehicle, a different timeline. Reese caught this detail at the last moment and understood it immediately. She was not part of Bravo Team's story officially. She was adjacent to it in the classified category, in the section of the report that would be redacted before it reached the permanent file. He looked at her once as the helicopter lifted. She was already watching the tree line. 6 months passed the way 6 months pass when you're no longer in the place where the hard thing happened. Marcus Delane spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in Germany, where a surgical team fixed his leg with the precision of people who had fixed this kind of injury many times before. The physical recovery was straightforward. The other kind of recovery, the kind that doesn't show up on an imaging scan but is visible in the way a person moves through a room, the way they answer a question, the weight they carry in the quiet moments, took longer and required different tools. His daughter Claire came to Germany in the 3rd week. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and she sat in the chair beside his hospital bed and colored in a book she had brought from home, occasionally showing him a page and asking him if the sky was supposed to be purple or blue, and he told her it could be either one, and she accepted this with the seriousness it deserved. He watched her color and said nothing about resignation paperwork, and said nothing about drainage channels, and said nothing about the 19 hours that a woman named Elena Vasquez had spent making sure Claire still had a father to ask about the color of the sky. He was not permitted to name Vasquez in the one interview he gave, a short conversation with a local newspaper in the town where he had grown up, arranged because the journalist was the daughter of a man Delaine had known since childhood, and the question of what had happened in Afghanistan felt, at that particular moment, like something he wanted to put words to. The words he chose were careful and accurate as far as they went. He said that his recovery had been made possible by a joint special operations effort involving individuals whose identities he was not in a position to share. He said that he had encountered, in the field, a level of professionalism that had changed the way he understood what that word meant. The journalist asked if he wanted to say anything else. He thought for a moment. He said that sometimes the people who make the most difference are the ones you never hear about, and that he thought people should keep that in mind. The journalist printed it, and a handful of people read it, and most of them moved on to the next thing, and a small number of them did not. Elena Vasquez received a commendation 4 months after the mission. It was presented in a small room by a person whose rank was high enough that the room was taken seriously, and the words used to describe what she had done were accurate and measured and genuine. The commendation was physical, a document, in a frame, the language of it formal and specific. She thanked the person who presented it and carried it back to her rental unit in Virginia Beach and put it in the box. There were 3 others in the box. She did not count them or compare them. She put the new one on top and closed the box and put the box back in the closet. Then she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph she had taken out of her kit when she got home, the one she hadn't looked at since hour 3 of the Coast mission, and she looked at it for a long time. The photograph was of a road in New Mexico, taken from a car window, late afternoon light across the high desert, the kind of light that made the whole landscape look like it was made of something worth keeping. She had taken it on a drive she had taken alone during a leave 3 years ago, when she had needed to be in a place that felt like itself without requiring anything from her. She had pulled over and taken the picture with her phone, and she had printed it and put it in her kit, and she had looked at it when she needed to remember what she was oriented toward. She looked at it now. She drank her coffee. The next deployment briefing was in 11 days. Jordan Reese went home to his family in coastal Virginia, a wife named Anne who had learned, over 8 years of this kind of marriage, to read the particular quality of his silence when he returned from a deployment, and to know which kind required space and which kind required proximity. This one, she determined within the first few hours, required proximity, and she provided it without making a project of it, which was one of the reasons the marriage worked. He did not tell her the details. He told her what he was permitted to tell her, which was less than the whole thing but more than nothing, and she received it with the understanding that the gap between what he told her and what had actually happened was filled with things that had reasons for remaining where they were. He did tell her that something had changed for him, not in a dramatic way, in the way that things change when you see a thing done at a level that resets your understanding of the category. He told her he had seen someone do a job, the specific job, in the specific way it needs to be done in the specific conditions it was done in, with a quality of presence that he was still trying to find the right word for. Anne asked him what word he landed on. He thought about Vasquez at the compound wall. The protein bar, 3 seconds. Complete, he said. She was just complete. Anne looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded, because she understood what he meant even without the context, because it was the same quality she had recognized in him 11 years ago, and it was the reason she had stayed. Owen Garrett went back to his unit and within 2 weeks submitted a formal after-action addendum recommending commendation for the recovery asset involved in the Coast mission. He named what he had observed. He described it in the precise language he used for everything, which meant it was both accurate and understated, which was the only way he knew how to write. The addendum was redacted before it reached the permanent file. The section that mentioned Vasquez by classification, not by name, because he didn't know her name, was removed entirely. He found out about the redactions 6 weeks later, when a routine records review produced a version of the document with a blank where the addendum had been. He sat with that for a day. Then he did something that was not in any official record and would never be in any official record. He told the story, not to a journalist, not to anyone outside the community, but to a young operator in his unit who was preparing for his first deployment and who had asked Garrett, over a meal in the team room, what the most important thing he had ever seen in the field was. Garrett told him, He changed the location. He changed the timeline. He kept the details that mattered: the drainage channel, the 19 hours, the protein bar, the wall, the 3 seconds, and the quality of presence that he did not have the right word for either, but that he described as well as he could and trusted the young man to receive. The young man received it. His name was Danny Cole, and he was 23 years old, and he filed the story in the part of himself where he kept things that he thought would matter later. He was right. 18 months after the Coast mission, Danny Cole found himself in a situation that had no good options. His team was pinned in a building in a province that was not Coast, but shared its qualities: cold, high, unforgiving of error, and the communication window had closed 40 minutes ago and would not open for another 90. And the decision he was being asked to make by the situation, not by any person but by the pure arithmetic of the situation, was one that required him to choose between two outcomes, neither of which he had trained himself to accept. He had been in the field for 14 months. He had made hard decisions before. He knew the texture of a hard decision, the particular weight of it, the way it sat in the chest differently from other kinds of weight. This one felt heavier than the others. He sat with his back against the wall and thought about what to do. And then, for reasons he could not have fully articulated in the moment, he thought about a protein bar. Not dramatically, not as a revelation, just as a thing he knew, a piece of information he carried in the place where he kept things that mattered, filed next to his training and his experience and the 11 months of field deployments that had been building his understanding of what actually works when everything else falls away. He thought about a woman he didn't know, in a place he hadn't been, eating a protein bar against a wall after 19 hours of doing something that would not appear in any document he would ever have access to. He thought about the way Garrett had described her, not the actions, not the outcome, but the quality. The fact that the protein bar and the 19 hours were the same thing. The fact that a person could exist in a situation like that and simply continue to be exactly what the situation required, without fracture, without performance, without the kind of noise that people make when they need the difficulty to be seen. He thought about that for about 30 seconds. Then he made the correct decision. It was not a dramatic decision in the way that decisions get described afterward. It was a decision that required him to hold two things at once, the immediate problem and the longer horizon, and to weight them correctly and move. He moved. The situation resolved in the way that situations resolve when the decision at the center of them is correct, not cleanly, not without cost, but in the direction of intact rather than broken. Afterward, sitting in the debrief, one of the senior operators asked him how he had read the situation. Danny Cole thought about how to answer. He said he had thought about something someone told him once, a story about someone he had never met, doing something that had no official name, in a place he had never been. He said it had given him a way to think about what the situation required. The senior operator asked him what the story was. Danny Cole shook his head, not because he wasn't willing to tell it, but because he understood in that moment that the story was not his to formalize. It was his to carry. It was his to pass on in the right moment to the right person, with the details changed and the center kept intact. He understood this the way you understand things that someone trusted you with, not because they explained the terms of the trust, but because the trust itself carried its own instructions. He said, "I'll tell you sometime." And he would. Meanwhile, in a different country, in conditions that her file did not describe, and her name did not appear near in any document that would be declassified in the next decade, Alina Vasquez was doing the thing she did. She had been on the ground for 11 hours. The kit on her back weighed 38 pounds, same as always. The mission brief had contained 4 lines of usable information and a great deal of operational discretion, same as always. She was moving through terrain that did not forgive error, at a pace that would get her where she needed to be at the time she needed to be there, and she was thinking about exactly 3 things: the ground in front of her, the ground 3 steps ahead, and the person she was going to find at the end of the route and bring back out. She was not thinking about the box in the closet. She was not thinking about the photograph of the road in New Mexico. She was not thinking about Coast Province or Marcus Delane or Jordan Reese or the 3 seconds or the protein bar or the commendation that had joined 3 others in a frame she had not hung on a wall. She was thinking about the ground. She was thinking about the next step and the one after that. The door of what she was moving toward was still closed, and she was still walking toward it, and she was not going to stop until she reached it and opened it and brought out whoever was on the other side, because that was the work, and the work was real regardless of what any record said about it. And she had made her peace with that a long time ago in a way that had never actually looked like peace from the outside, but was, on the inside, the most settled thing she knew. She kept moving. The door was still ahead of her. She was getting there.